The day Ruby Callahan's father tried to sell her like livestock on a saloon porch, she learned that survival in the frontier wasn't about strength, it was about refusing to break. This is a story about a girl who had nothing, lost everything, and still found the courage to fight back against the cruelest man in the territory. It's a story of fire, blood, and the choice that changed an entire valley forever. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruby's story travels across the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden porch of the Broken Wheel Saloon, turning the already stifling air into something thick and suffocating. Ruby Callahan stood there with her hands bound loosely in front of her, not with rope, but with shame so heavy it might as well have been iron chains. Her dress, once a pale blue that her mother had sewn with careful hands, was now stained with trail dust and torn at the hem. Her dark hair hung limp around her face, and her green eyes, eyes that used to spark with defiance, were dulled by exhaustion and hunger. Around her, the mining town of Salvation Ridge had gathered like vultures circling a dying animal. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" Her father's voice boomed across the crowd, slurred and thick with whiskey. Thomas Callahan swayed on his feet, his shirt stained with alcohol and vomit, his face red and bloated from years of drinking away every dollar he'd ever earned. "She's 18, strong as an ox, and she can cook, clean, and mend. Hell, she practically raised herself after her mama died." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cruel, mocking laughter that cut deeper than any blade. Ruby wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear into the dust and never be seen again. But her legs wouldn't move. Her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, trembling, while her father auctioned off the last shred of dignity she had left. "Come on now, don't be shy," Thomas bellowed, gesturing wildly at the crowd. "I need $500 to settle my debt with Mr. Boone, and this girl here is worth every penny. She's got her mama's looks, and her daddy's, well, she's got her mama's looks." More laughter. A few men elbowed each other and grinned. One of them, a thick-necked miner with a scarred face, called out, "She looks half-starved, Tom. You even feed her?" "She eats when I eat," Thomas shot back defensively. "Now quit wasting time and make me an offer." Ruby's stomach twisted. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her father had gambled away their last supplies 3 nights ago in a poker game with Jeremiah Boone, the man who owned the Broken Wheel and half the businesses in Salvation Ridge. Boone was the kind of man who smiled when he ruined people, who built his empire on fear and broken promises. And now Thomas owed him money he could never repay. So here she was, payment. $200, a voice called from the back of the crowd. It belonged to a rancher named Hodge, a man with mean eyes and meaner hands. Ruby had seen him beat a horse to death once for stumbling. The thought of belonging to him made her skin crawl. Thomas frowned. "200? Are you out of your damn mind? She's worth twice that." "Then find someone stupid enough to pay it," Hodge sneered. Ruby's father turned back to the crowd, desperation creeping into his voice. "Come on, boys. Surely one of you has the sense to see what a bargain this is. She's young, she's healthy, and she'll work harder than any hired hand you've ever had." The crowd murmured, but no one raised the bid. Ruby could feel their eyes on her, assessing her like a piece of livestock. Some looked at her with pity. Most looked at her with amusement. A few looked at her with something far worse, hunger that had nothing to do with food. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her mother's face. Sarah Callahan had been strong, kind, and fiercely protective of her daughter. She'd died of fever 4 years ago, leaving Ruby alone with a father who'd spent every day since drowning his grief in whiskey and cards. Before she died, Sarah had whispered something to Ruby in her final moments. Something about land, about a legacy, about being stronger than the world that would try to break her. Ruby hadn't understood it then. She still didn't. All she knew was that her mother would be horrified to see her now. $250, another voice called. This one belonged to a shopkeeper named Brennan, a widower who already had 3 daughters at home. Ruby didn't know if that made him better or worse than Hodge. Thomas perked up slightly. "Now we're talking. Do I hear 300? Silence. Bob. "Come on!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. $300. That's nothing for a girl like this." Still silence. Ruby opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. She saw familiar faces, people she'd grown up around, people who'd known her mother, people who'd once smiled at her in the street. Now they just stared, their expressions ranging from indifference to disgust. None of them would help her. None of them would stop this. In Salvation Ridge, the weak were prey. And Ruby had never felt weaker in her entire life. Just as Thomas opened his mouth to speak again, the crowd suddenly shifted. Heads turned toward the far end of the street, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered people. A rider was approaching. He sat tall in the saddle of a massive black horse, moving at an unhurried pace that somehow commanded attention. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a gun belt that sat comfortably on his hips. Everything about him radiated quiet strength and absolute control. The crowd parted instinctively as he rode closer. Ruby had never seen him before. Salvation Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone, but this man was a stranger. As he drew nearer, she could make out more details: broad shoulders, strong jaw, and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. He looked to be in his early 30s, weathered by hard living but not broken by it. He stopped his horse directly in front of the saloon porch and sat there for a long moment, studying the scene with an expression that gave nothing away. Thomas, never one to miss an opportunity, plastered on his most obsequious smile. "Well, well, a newcomer! Welcome to Salvation Ridge, friend. You've arrived just in time to participate in a very special—" "What's happening here?" the stranger interrupted. His voice was low and calm, but it cut through Thomas's rambling like a knife through butter. Thomas blinked. I'm settling a debt, is all. Offering my daughter to the highest bidder, fair and square." The stranger's gaze shifted to Ruby. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone looked at her like she was actually human, not property, not merchandise, just a person. The weight of that gaze made something crack inside her chest. "Does she want this?" the stranger asked quietly. The question was so unexpected that for a moment no one spoke. Thomas laughed nervously. "Want it? Well, I mean, it ain't really about what she wants, friend. It's about settling accounts. Man's got to pay his debts, and—" "I asked her," the stranger said, his eyes never leaving Ruby's face. "Not you." Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. Her mouth was dry. Her hands shook. Every eye in the crowd was on her now, waiting to see what she would say. Her father's face had gone pale with panic. If she ruined this for him, if she made him look like a fool in front of Boone and the whole town, there would be hell to pay later. But as she stood there, staring into the stranger's steady gaze, she realized something that made her bones go cold and her spine go straight. She had nothing left to lose. "No," she whispered. The stranger tilted his head slightly. "Say it again. Louder." Ruby's voice came out stronger this time, fueled by 4 years of grief and rage and starvation. "No, I don't want this." Thomas's face turned purple. "Now you listen here, girl. How much does he owe?" the stranger asked, cutting him off again. Thomas sputtered. "What?" "The debt. How much?" $500, Thomas said slowly, suspicion creeping into his voice. "But that don't mean—" The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it to Thomas, who caught it clumsily and nearly dropped it. When Thomas opened the pouch and saw the gold coins inside, his eyes went wide. "That's 600, the stranger said flatly. "The extra 100 is to make sure you never come near her again." Thomas stared at the money, then at the stranger, then at Ruby. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But she's my daughter." "Not anymore." The stranger swung down from his horse and walked up the porch steps. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to prove himself to anyone. When he reached Ruby, he stopped and looked at her again with those unreadable eyes. "My name is Colt Mercer. I have a ranch about 30 miles north of here, up in the high country. It's hard work, cold winters, and there's no one around for miles. But you'll have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and no one will own you." He paused, then added quietly, "If you want to come." Ruby couldn't breathe. This had to be a trick. Men like this didn't exist. No one did something for nothing. No one offered freedom without expecting something worse in return. But when she looked into Colt Mercer's eyes, she didn't see cruelty or hunger or the cold calculation she'd seen in every other man in Salvation Ridge. She saw nothing. Just calm, steady patience, like he'd wait all day for her answer and wouldn't judge her either way. Why? She managed to ask. Why would you do this? Something flickered in his expression, so brief she almost missed it. Because I know what it's like to be sold, he said simply. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the crowd. Well now, isn't this touching? The crowd parted again, and this time the murmurs were tinged with fear. Jeremiah Boone stepped into view. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a black suit that must have cost more than most people in Salvation Ridge earned in a year. His silver hair was slicked back, his mustache perfectly trimmed, and his smile was the kind that made Ruby's skin crawl. He looked like a gentleman. He was anything but. Two men flanked him, hired guns with dead eyes and quick hands. Boone never went anywhere without muscle. Mr. Mercer, is it? Boone said pleasantly as he approached the porch. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You see, Thomas here owes me that money, and while I appreciate your generosity, the girl is collateral on a legal debt. You can't just buy her like a horse. Colt's expression didn't change. I just did. Boone's smile thinned. I don't think you understand how things work in Salvation Ridge, stranger. I own this town. The saloon, the general store, the bank, all mine. And when someone owes me money, they pay one way or another. He paid, Colt said, gesturing to Thomas, who was still clutching the pouch of gold coins. Debt's settled. That's not how this works, Boone said, his voice losing its pleasant edge. The girl is mine until I say otherwise. That was the agreement. Colt took a step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening, but something in the movement made Boone's hired guns tense and reach for their weapons. I don't care about your agreement, Colt said quietly. I don't care about your town, and I don't care who you think you are. The girl said no. The debt is paid, and if you try to stop us from leaving, we're going to have a problem. The entire street went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Boone stared at Colt for a long moment, his jaw working. His hired guns waited for the signal to draw. The crowd watched, transfixed. Then Boone smiled again. It was a terrible smile, full of promises and threats. You're making a very big mistake, Mr. Mercer. Wouldn't be the first time, Colt replied evenly. He turned to Ruby and extended his hand. You coming? Ruby looked at his hand. Then at her father, who was staring at the gold coins like they were the only thing that mattered in the world. Then at Boone, whose smile promised retribution. Then at the crowd, who'd watched her humiliation like it was a show. She took Colt's hand. His grip was warm and steady. He helped her down the porch steps, and together they walked to his horse. The crowd parted silently, no one daring to interfere now that Boone had been openly defied. Colt mounted first, then pulled Ruby up behind him with easy strength. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Hold on, he said simply. Then he turned the horse and rode out of Salvation Ridge without looking back. Ruby did look back, just once. She saw her father still standing on the porch, counting his gold. She saw Boone watching them leave with that terrible smile. She saw the crowd already dispersing, moving on to the next bit of entertainment. And she saw the mountains rising in the distance, dark and forbidding and utterly unknown. She was terrified, but for the first time in 4 years, she was also free. They rode in silence for hours. The trail climbed steadily into the high country, leaving behind the dusty heat of Salvation Ridge for cooler air and pine-scented wind. Ruby had never been this far from town. Her entire world had been confined to a few square miles of misery, and now it was falling away behind her with every step the horse took. She didn't know what to say to the man she was clinging to. Didn't know if she should thank him or question him or just stay quiet and hope this wasn't all some elaborate trap. So she stayed quiet. Colt didn't seem to mind. He rode with the easy competence of someone who'd spent his whole life in the saddle, navigating the narrow mountain trails without hesitation. Occasionally he'd point out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree, a stream where the water ran cold and clear, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. But he didn't press her for conversation. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Ruby finally found her voice. Where are we going? My ranch, Colt said. Another few hours yet. And then what? He was quiet for a moment. Then you rest. Eat. Sleep as long as you need. After that, We'll figure out what comes next." "Why did you do it?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why did you pay all that money for someone you've never met?" Colt's shoulders shifted slightly, like he was considering how much to tell her. "I was in Salvation Ridge to buy supplies," he said eventually. "Saw the crowd gathered, saw what your father was doing, and I remembered what it felt like to be powerless." "You said you'd been sold," Ruby said quietly, in a manner of speaking. He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone suggested she shouldn't push. "Point is, I had a choice today. I could ride on and pretend I didn't see it, or I could do something. I did something. You could have just given him the money. You didn't have to take me with you." "And leave you there for the next drunk to bid on?" Colt's voice was flat. "No. You said you didn't want it. That was enough for me." Ruby didn't know what to say to that. In her experience, men didn't care what women wanted. They took what they pleased and called it their right. But Colt Mercer wasn't like any man she'd ever met. They rode on as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped steadily, and Ruby shivered despite herself. Without a word, Colt reached back and handed her a blanket from his saddlebag. She wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded. It was full dark by the time they reached the ranch. Ruby couldn't see much in the moonlight, but she got impressions. A sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that looked well-maintained, corrals and fences that spoke of careful work. Everything was neat, orderly, and utterly isolated. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. Colt dismounted and helped Ruby down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. She'd been riding for so long that her muscles had locked up. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "Stable's that way," he said, gesturing. "I'll get the horse settled. You go inside and light the lamps. There's bread and dried meat in the cupboard if you're hungry." Ruby walked to the cabin on shaking legs. The door was unlocked. Who would rob a place this remote? And she stepped into darkness. It took her a moment to find matches and light a lamp, but when she did, warm light flooded a single large room. It was sparse but clean. A fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking pot hanging from an iron hook. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A bed, an actual bed with a real mattress, occupied one corner, while the other corner held shelves stacked with supplies and books. Everything was organized, purposeful, and utterly masculine. Ruby found the cupboard and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was exactly what Colt had promised: a half loaf of bread, some dried venison, and a tin of coffee. Her stomach cramped at the sight of food. She grabbed the bread and bit into it without even thinking, tearing off chunks and swallowing them so fast she nearly choked. She was still eating when Colt came back inside. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment, then went to the fireplace and started building a fire without comment. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, pushing back the cold. "There's a pump outside for water," he said, hanging his coat and hat on pegs by the door. "Outhouse is behind the barn. I'll set up a partition in here tomorrow so you have some privacy, but for tonight, you take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." Ruby stopped chewing. "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "You're exhausted, half-starved, and you've been through hell today. I'm not letting you sleep on the floor." "But, Ruby," he said her name like it was a simple fact. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you, and no one's going to ask you for anything you don't want to give. But you need to rest. So eat, drink some water, and go to sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could manage, that she wasn't weak, that she didn't need charity. But her body had other ideas. The moment she finished the bread, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes burned. Her limbs felt like lead. Colt pulled a bedroll out from under the bed and spread it near the fire. "Go on," he said gently. Ruby walked to the bed on numb legs and sat down. The mattress was stuffed with straw and covered with rough blankets, but it felt like heaven compared to the hard floor she'd been sleeping on for months. She lay down fully clothed, too tired to even remove her boots. The last thing she saw before sleep dragged her under was Colt sitting by the fire, his profile silhouetted against the flames, watching over her like some kind of silent guardian. A sex. Ruby woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The saloon porch, her father's betrayal, Boone's terrible smile, and the stranger who'd paid for her freedom. She sat up slowly, her body aching in a dozen places. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, painting everything in shades of gold. Colt stood at the fireplace, tending a skillet with practiced efficiency. "Morning," he said without turning around. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Breakfast will be ready in a minute." Ruby stumbled to the basin and splashed cold water on her face. It felt like washing away a layer of grime that had built up over years, not just days. When she looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror hanging above the basin, she barely recognized the face staring back. Gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes, hair that hadn't been properly washed in weeks. She looked like someone who'd survived a war. Maybe she had. Colt dished out bacon and eggs onto 2 tin plates and set them on the table. Ruby sat down carefully, still half expecting this to be a dream, and picked up her fork. The food was simple but hot and plentiful. She ate slowly this time, savoring every bite. "Thank you," she said when her plate was empty. "For the food, for everything." Colt nodded. "We need to talk about what happens next." Ruby's stomach tightened. Here it was. The catch. The price. Nothing in this world came free. "Okay," she said quietly. Colt leaned back in his chair and studied her with those unreadable eyes. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're free. If you want to leave, I'll take you to the nearest town and give you enough money to get started somewhere else. No questions asked." Ruby blinked. "You'd just let me go?" "It's your choice," he said simply. "Always has been." "And if I stay?" "Then you work. This is a working ranch, and I can't run it alone. I'm not looking for a wife or a—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not looking for anything except help. You'll have your own space, your own money from the work you do, and the respect you deserve. But it won't be easy. Winter up here is brutal. The work is hard, and there's no one around for miles if you need help." Ruby absorbed this slowly. "You'd pay me." "For the work you do, yes. Same as I'd pay any hired hand." It was such a foreign concept that she almost laughed. Being paid for her labor, being treated like an equal, having choices. "What kind of work?" she asked. Colt gestured vaguely. "Right now? Planting. The growing season is short up here, so we've got to get crops in the ground fast. After that, there's livestock to tend, fences to mend, firewood to cut for winter. I've got 20 head of cattle, some chickens, and 2 horses besides the one we rode in on. It's not a big operation, but it keeps me busy." Ruby thought about it. She could leave, try to start over somewhere else with money in her pocket and no ties. But where would she go? She had no family except a father who'd sold her, no friends, no skills except the hard labor her mother had taught her before dying. At least here, she knew what to expect. Hard work, isolation, but also safety, respect, freedom. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "At least for now." Something that might have been relief flickered across Colt's face. "All right, then let's get you set up properly." He stood and crossed to one of the shelves, returning with a stack of folded clothes. "These belong to my brother. They'll be too big, but they're better for ranch work than that dress. There's a screen behind the barn where you can change and wash up properly." Ruby took the clothes, feeling their weight. "Your brother?" "He died 3 years ago. Winter fever." Colt's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ruby heard the grief underneath. "It's just me now." "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged. "Life in the high country is hard. You lose people. You keep going." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. Over the next few days, Ruby learned what hard work really meant. Colt was a patient teacher, but a demanding one. He showed her how to plant seeds in the rocky soil, spacing them just right to maximize the short growing season. He taught her how to check the cattle for injury or illness, how to mend fences with wire and muscle, how to split firewood without taking off a finger. Her hands blistered and bled. Her back screamed in protest. Her muscles burned from labor they'd never done before. But she'd also never felt more alive. Every night, she collapsed into bed too exhausted to think. Every morning, she woke to coffee and breakfast and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd earned both. Colt treated her exactly as he'd promised, like a hired hand, not property. When she did something well, he acknowledged it with a brief nod. When she made mistakes, he corrected her patiently and showed her the right way. He never yelled, never raised a hand, never looked at her with anything except professional respect. It was so different from her father that sometimes Ruby wanted to cry from the sheer relief of it. 3 weeks after arriving at the ranch, Ruby was in the barn feeding the chickens when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She froze, her heart jumping into her throat. No one came up here. No one except... She ran to the cabin and found Colt already standing in the doorway, his rifle in hand. His expression was calm, but his body was tense. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Even from a distance, Ruby recognized the man in the lead. Jeremiah Boone sat astride a magnificent gray horse, looking utterly out of place in his expensive suit and polished boots. Behind him rode one of his hired guns, a scarred man named Pike, who had a reputation for cruelty. Ruby's blood turned to ice. Boone had found them. Colt stepped out of the cabin, the rifle held loosely but ready. "This is private property," he called out. "State your business or turn around." Boone smiled that terrible smile as he reined in his horse. "Mr. Mercer, how nice to see you again. And young Ruby, my, you're looking much healthier than when we last met. Hard work agrees with you." "What do you want, Boone?" Colt's voice was flat. "Just to deliver a message." Boone's eyes shifted to Ruby, and she felt pinned like a butterfly under glass. "You see, Ruby, there's been a very interesting development. Your late mother, rest her soul, appears to have owned a rather valuable piece of property, a river crossing about 10 miles south of here, controls the water flow to most of the valley ranches." Ruby's heart stopped. Her mother's whispered words on her deathbed suddenly came rushing back. The crossing, the papers. Hidden. Don't let them. "And?" Colt said coldly. "And," Boone continued pleasantly, "according to territorial law, that property should have passed to her husband upon her death. Your father, Ruby, who, as it happens, signed over all his assets to me last week to cover additional gambling debts." The world tilted sideways. Ruby grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" Boone pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. "This is a deed transfer, properly witnessed and filed with the territorial office. The river crossing is mine. And since you've been trespassing on my property, or at least living on a ranch that depends on water from my river, I thought it only neighborly to inform you." Colt's knuckles whitened on the rifle. "That crossing is accessible to all the ranchers. It's been that way for 20 years. "Not anymore." Boone's smile widened. "Starting next week, I'll be charging a toll for water access. Reasonable rates, of course. And if anyone refuses to pay..." He shrugged delicately. "Well, a man has the right to protect his property, doesn't he?" Ruby felt sick. The river crossing was the lifeblood of every ranch in the region. Without access to water, livestock would die, crops would fail, and families would starve. Boone wasn't just claiming land, he was claiming control over the entire valley. And it was all because of her mother. "There's got to be another way," Ruby said desperately. "Another water source." "There isn't." Colt's voice was grim. "That crossing is the only reliable source for miles. If Boone controls it, he controls everything." "Precisely." Boone tipped his hat mockingly. "I do hope you'll spread the word among your neighbors, Mr. Mercer. I'd hate for anyone to be surprised when they find my men guarding the crossing next week. Good day." He wheeled his horse and rode off, Pike following like a loyal dog. Ruby stood frozen, her mind racing. This was her fault. Her mother's legacy, meant to protect her, had instead painted a target on her back. If Boone controlled the water, he controlled the valley, and everyone would know it was because of property that should have been Ruby's. They'd hate her for it. "Ruby," Colt's voice cut through her spiral. "Look at me." She met his eyes. They were still calm, still steady, but there was steel underneath now. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Boone's claim might not be legal. Your mother might have protected that land in ways he doesn't know about. But we need to find out for sure." "How?" Ruby asked desperately. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's someone who might know. A woman named Naya Red Elk. She was your mother's friend, helped her with legal matters before she died. If anyone knows what your mother intended, it'll be her." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest. "Where is she?" 2 days' ride east. She runs a trading post and serves as a healer for the scattered homesteads out that way. He paused. It won't be an easy trip. And once we start asking questions, Boone will know we're fighting back. Ruby thought about her mother's final words, about the terrible smile on Boone's face, about the valley full of families who would suffer if he controlled the water. She thought about the girl on the saloon porch, too terrified to speak. That girl was gone. Then let's go, Ruby said firmly, before it's too late. Colt nodded slowly. All right, we leave at first light. As he turned to go back inside, Ruby made herself a promise. She'd been powerless once, sold like property, treated like she didn't matter, never again. If Jeremiah Boone wanted a fight, he was going to get one. And Ruby Callahan was done running. They left before dawn, when the world was still painted in shades of gray, and the air carried the sharp bite of mountain cold. Ruby wore her borrowed clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a thick wool shirt, and boots that were 2 sizes too large but far better than the torn slippers she'd arrived in. Colt had given her a coat that had belonged to his brother, and though it hung loose on her frame, it kept the wind at bay. The journey east took them through country Ruby had never seen before. They descended from the high peaks into rolling foothills covered in sage and scattered pine, then across a wide valley where wildflowers bloomed in defiant bursts of color against the harsh landscape. Colt rode with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, navigating trails that were barely visible and stopping occasionally to let the horses drink from cold streams. Ruby tried to memorize everything, the way he read the land, the careful attention he paid to the horses, the small gestures that kept them safe in country that could kill the careless. She'd spent her whole life in Salvation Ridge, and now she realized how little she'd actually known about the world beyond it. "Tell me about Naya," she said on the second morning as they broke camp. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Colt poured the last of the coffee onto the fire, watching the flames hiss and die. "She's Dakota. Came west with a trading company about 15 years ago and decided to stay. Set up a post at the crossroads where the old territorial trail meets the river route. Serves as a healer, a mediator, and the closest thing to law these parts have outside the territorial courts. And she knew my mother? They were close." He rolled up the bedding with efficient movements. "Your mother used to ride out to see her every few months. I don't know what they talked about, but Sarah always came back looking settled, like she'd found answers to questions that had been eating at her." Ruby absorbed this slowly. Her mother had kept so many secrets. Sometimes Ruby wondered if she'd ever really known Sarah Callahan at all. "Did you know her well?" she asked. "My mother?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his hand stilling on the bedroll. "Well enough. She was kind to me when I first came to this territory, treated me like a person instead of—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "She was a good woman, better than most people deserved." There was something in his voice that made Ruby think there was more to that story, but she didn't push. Everyone had ghosts out here. She was learning that some things were better left unspoken until the person was ready to share them. They mounted up and rode on, the sun climbing higher and the temperature rising as they left the mountains behind. By midday, they'd reached the edge of a wide river that cut through the valley like a silver snake. Colt guided them along the bank until they came to a cluster of buildings nestled where the river bent eastward. The trading post was larger than Ruby had expected. A main building constructed of logs and river stone with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it stood a barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what looked like a garden bursting with vegetables and herbs. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in the dirt near the front steps. A woman emerged from the main building as they approached. She was tall and lean, with long black hair streaked with gray that she wore in a single braid down her back. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. She wore a buckskin dress and moccasins, and her dark eyes were sharp as she studied the riders. "Colt Mercer," she said, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "I wondered how long it would take you to bring her here." Colt swung down from his horse. "Naya." The woman's gaze shifted to Ruby, and something complicated flickered across her face. Recognition, grief, and something that might have been relief. "You look like your mother," she said softly. "Same eyes. Same stubborn chin." Ruby dismounted carefully, suddenly nervous. You knew her well. Better than most. Naya gestured toward the building. Come inside. We have much to discuss, and the walls have better ears than the open air. The interior of the trading post was dim and cool after the bright sunlight. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour and coffee to ammunition and leather goods. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a sharp, clean scent. Naya poured them coffee from a pot that sat warming on the stove, then settled into a chair and fixed Ruby with that penetrating stare. Jeremiah Boone came to see me last week, she said without preamble. Showed me a deed transfer for the river crossing. Claimed it was his now, bought and paid for through your father's debts. Ruby's stomach dropped. Is it legal? That depends. Naya took a sip of coffee. Your mother came to me 4 years ago, just before she died. She was worried about what would happen to you if she passed. Your father was already drinking heavily, gambling away everything they had. She knew it was only a matter of time before he'd try to use you to settle his debts. So she did something, Colt said quietly. Naya nodded. She had me draw up papers that would protect the river crossing, put it in a trust with specific conditions. The land could only pass to you, Ruby, and only when you turned 18. Your father had no legal claim to it, no matter what debts he owed or what documents he signed. Hope surged in Ruby's chest. Then Boone's claim is invalid? It should be. Naya's expression darkened. But there's a problem. The original documents were supposed to be filed with the territorial office in Silver Creek. I gave them to your mother with instructions to deliver them personally. She promised she would, but she spread her hands helplessly. She died before I could confirm they were registered, and I haven't been able to find any record of them. The hope died as quickly as it had flared. So Boone might actually own it? Not if we can prove your mother filed the papers. Naya leaned forward. But that means going to Silver Creek, searching the records, and possibly facing Boone's lawyers if he's already started legal proceedings. It won't be easy. Ruby thought about the valley full of families who depended on that water, about Boone's terrible smile and the power he'd wield if he controlled the crossing, about her mother's whispered words and the legacy she'd tried to protect. How far is Silver Creek, she asked. 3 days' hard ride south. Naya's eyes gleamed with approval. The territorial courthouse there handles all land disputes for this region. If the papers were filed, that's where they'll be. Colt set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. Boone will have people watching the courthouse. The moment we start asking questions, he'll know. Then we'll have to be smarter than his people, Ruby said firmly. Both Colt and Naya looked at her with surprise. Ruby met their gazes without flinching. She was done being the frightened girl who waited for others to solve her problems. My mother tried to protect me, she continued. She went to all this trouble to make sure I'd have something that couldn't be taken away. The least I can do is fight for it. For her. For everyone who'll suffer if Boone gets that land. Naya smiled slowly. Sarah would be proud of you. The words hit Ruby harder than she'd expected. She'd spent so long feeling like a disappointment, a burden, someone who couldn't live up to her mother's strength. Hearing that she might have made Sarah proud felt like a gift she didn't deserve. I'll come with you, Naya said, standing. I know the clerks at the courthouse, and I have copies of the documents your mother signed. They might help us search faster. That's not necessary, Colt began, but Naya cut him off with a sharp gesture. Boone has been squeezing the small ranchers and homesteaders for years, buying up land, controlling resources, making it impossible for anyone to stand against him. If there's a chance to break his hold on this territory, I'm taking it. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. Besides, you'll need someone who knows how to navigate territorial law. Colt, you're good at many things, but legal maneuvering isn't one of them. Colt looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded. We leave in the morning, then. Give the horses a night to rest. Naya showed them to a small cabin behind the main building where travelers could stay for a few coins. It was simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a wood stove. Ruby collapsed onto one of the beds, exhaustion from days of riding catching up with her all at once. Get some rest, Colt said from the doorway. Tomorrow's going to be a long ride. But Ruby couldn't rest. Her mind kept spinning, replaying everything she'd learned. Her mother had tried to protect her, had known what kind of man Thomas Callahan would become, had taken steps to ensure Ruby would have something of her own. And Ruby had never known. She thought about all the times she'd resented her mother's secrets, the whispered conversations with Naya, the mysterious trips to Silver Creek. She'd thought Sarah was keeping things from her out of mistrust. Now she understood it had been love. Ruby. Naya's voice came from the doorway. The older woman stepped inside, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. I need to give you something. She set the bundle on the bed and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Your mother left this with me. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you when you were ready. Ruby's hands trembled as she took the journal. The leather was soft from years of handling, and when she opened it, she recognized her mother's careful handwriting on the first page. For Ruby, when she's strong enough to carry what I couldn't, tears blurred her vision. She blinked them away and began to read. The journal chronicled her mother's life before Salvation Ridge, a life Ruby had never known existed. Sarah hadn't been born in the frontier. She'd come from back east, from a wealthy family that had disowned her when she'd refused an arranged marriage. She'd fled west with nothing but determination and a small inheritance her grandmother had left her. That inheritance had bought the river crossing. Ruby read faster, her heart pounding. Her mother had purchased the land years before meeting Thomas Callahan, seeing its strategic importance. She'd kept it secret, knowing that if her husband discovered it, he'd gamble it away like everything else. The crossing had been her insurance, her safety net, her way of ensuring Ruby would never be powerless. But Sarah had made a mistake. She'd trusted Thomas with the knowledge of the land's existence during a moment of weakness, thinking marriage had changed him. He'd immediately begun planning how to use it for his own gain. That's when Sarah had gone to Naya and created the trust. The final entry was dated 3 days before Sarah's death. I'm running out of time. The fever is worse, and I can feel myself slipping away. I managed to file the papers in Silver Creek last week, but I'm not sure if I did everything correctly. I was so sick, so weak. The clerk seemed confused by some of the documents. I should have brought Naya with me, but I was afraid of drawing attention. If you're reading this, my darling girl, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry I married a man who proved to be weaker than I hoped. I'm sorry for all the ways I failed you, but I need you to know this. You are stronger than you think. You have my determination and your own fierce heart. Don't let this harsh world break you. Don't let men like Boone or your father convince you that you're powerless. The river crossing is yours. Fight for it. Not because of the money or the power, but because it represents something important. The right to control your own destiny. The right to say no. I love you more than words can hold. Stay strong. Stay free. Mother Ruby closed the journal with shaking hands. Naya was watching her with an expression of deep understanding. She loved you very much, the older woman said softly. I know, Ruby's voice cracked. I just wish I'd understood sooner. You understand now. That's what matters. Naya moved to the door, then paused. Your mother was one of the strongest people I ever knew. She survived things that would have broken most women, and she passed that strength to you. Tomorrow, when we ride to Silver Creek, remember that. Boone thinks he's fighting a frightened girl. He has no idea what's coming for him. After Naya left, Ruby lay in the darkness, clutching her mother's journal to her chest. She thought about the woman who'd written those words. Not the tired, sick mother she remembered from those final months, but the fierce, determined woman who'd fled her old life and built a new one from nothing. Sarah Callahan had been a fighter, and so would her daughter. The ride to Silver Creek took them through increasingly settled country. They passed homesteads and small ranches, crossed well-traveled roads, and saw more people in a single day than Ruby had encountered in weeks at Colt's isolated ranch. The transformation from wilderness to civilization was jarring. Silver Creek itself was a proper town, 10 times the size of Salvation Ridge. It had actual streets, a hotel, a bank, and a 2-story courthouse made of brick and stone that dominated the central square. People moved through the streets with purpose, and Ruby noticed that many of them had a haunted, worried look that she recognized all too well. Boone's influence reaches this far, Naya said quietly as they tied their horses outside the courthouse. Half the businesses here owe him money. The other half are too afraid of him to resist. They climbed the courthouse steps and entered a cavernous hall that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. A clerk sat behind a tall desk, laboriously copying documents in a ledger. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Well, we need to search the land registry, Naya said without preamble. Records filed approximately 4 years ago regarding a river crossing property in the Northern Valley. The clerk looked up, his expression neutral but wary. That will require a formal request and a fee. Naya produced a handful of coins and set them on the desk. Will this suffice? The clerk counted the money, then nodded reluctantly. Wait here. He disappeared into a back room, leaving them standing in the echoing hall. Ruby's nerves were stretched tight. Every instinct screamed that this was too easy, that Boone must have anticipated this move. When the clerk returned, he carried a stack of dusty ledgers. 4 years ago, you said? Yes, property owner would be Sarah Callahan. The clerk began flipping through pages, his finger tracing columns of cramped handwriting. Ruby held her breath, hope and fear warring in her chest. Here, the clerk said finally. Sarah Callahan filed a land trust document on... He frowned. That's odd. What? Colt asked sharply. The entry is incomplete. There's a notation that documents were submitted, but there's no record of them being properly processed. It says here they were flagged for additional review. Ruby's heart sank. What does that mean? It means someone questioned the validity of the filing. Usually that happens when there's a competing claim or when the documents are unclear. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. Without the original papers, I can't tell you more. Where would the original documents be? Naya asked. The clerk gestured vaguely. In storage, but accessing them requires authorization from a judge, and that can take weeks. We don't have weeks, Ruby said desperately. The clerk gave her a sympathetic look. I'm sorry, miss, but those are the rules. They left the courthouse in frustrated silence. Ruby wanted to scream. Her mother had filed the papers, but some bureaucratic tangle had kept them from being processed. And now those documents were locked away, inaccessible, while Boone's fraudulent claim moved forward unchallenged. There has to be another way, she said, as they stood on the courthouse steps. There is? Naya's voice was grim. We find a lawyer willing to challenge Boone directly. Someone who can petition the court to review the original documents and expose the fraud. And where do we find someone like that? Colt asked. Naya pointed across the square to a small office with a weather-beaten sign that read, Thomas Blackwood, Attorney at Law. He's honest, competent, and he hates Jeremiah Boone almost as much as I do. The office was cramped and cluttered with legal books and stacks of papers. Thomas Blackwood himself was a middle-aged man with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd fought too many losing battles. But when Naya explained the situation, something sharp and determined flickered to life in his expression. Boone's been consolidating power in this territory for years, Blackwood said, leaning back in his creaking chair. Every time someone tries to stand up to him, he crushes them with money, lawyers, or hired guns. I've lost count of how many cases I've taken against him, and I've lost most of them. But not all, Naya said pointedly. Blackwood smiled thinly. No, not all. He turned to Ruby. If what you're saying is true, if your mother properly filed a land trust and Boone's claim is based on your father's fraudulent transfer, then we have a case, a strong one. But it won't be easy. Boone will fight us with everything he has. Are you prepared for that? Ruby thought about her mother's journal, about the words stay strong, stay free, about the valley full of families who would suffer under Boone's control. Yes, she said firmly, I'm prepared. Blackwood nodded slowly. Then I'll file a petition with the territorial judge first thing tomorrow morning. We'll request an emergency review of the land records and a temporary injunction preventing Boone from restricting access to the river crossing until the dispute is resolved. It's going to kick up a hornet's nest, but if we move fast enough, we might catch him off guard. How long will it take? Colt asked. For the hearing, a few weeks if we're lucky. For a final ruling? Blackwood shrugged. Could be months. Territorial courts move slowly, and Boone will file every delay and motion he can think of. But the injunction should buy us time. Ruby felt a weight lift slightly from her chest. It wasn't victory, but it was hope. And right now, hope was enough. They spent that night in Silver Creek's only hotel, a modest establishment that charged exorbitant rates for tiny rooms with thin walls. Ruby lay awake listening to the sounds of the town, horses passing in the street, distant music from a saloon, the low murmur of voices from neighboring rooms. She thought about everything that had happened in the past few weeks. She'd gone from being sold on a saloon porch to fighting for land she'd never known existed. From powerless to taking action. From invisible to standing up against the most feared man in the territory. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt awake. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Colt standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Ruby shook her head. They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, neither quite sure what to say. "I wanted to thank you," Ruby finally said, "for everything. You didn't have to help me. You could have left me in Salvation Ridge and none of this would be your problem." Colt's expression was unreadable. "I told you before. I know what it's like to be powerless. I meant that." "Will you tell me," Ruby asked quietly, "about what happened to you?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I was born on a plantation in Missouri. My mother was a slave. My father was the plantation owner's son." His voice was flat, emotionless. "When the war started, everything fell apart. My mother died of cholera. The plantation burned. I was 15 years old and suddenly free, but I had nowhere to go and no idea how to survive." Ruby's chest tightened. "A man found me wandering the roads," Colt continued. "Said he'd give me work, teach me a trade, treat me fair. I believed him. Turned out he was a bounty hunter who specialized in catching runaways and selling them back into bondage, war or no war. He kept me in chains for 2 years, dragging me from town to town like property." "How did you escape?" Ruby whispered. "He got drunk one night and fell asleep without securing my chains properly. I ran." Colt's jaw tightened. "Kept running until I reached the frontier, where no one cared about the color of my skin or where I came from, changed my name, started over, built a life where I answer to no one." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. "Don't be. It taught me something important. Freedom isn't something someone gives you. It's something you take and fight like hell to keep." He met her eyes. "Your mother understood that. She tried to give you the tools to fight. Now you're using them." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. "What if we lose? What if Boone's too powerful?" "Then we lose." Colt's voice was steady. "But at least you'll have fought. At least you'll know you didn't just surrender. And sometimes that's all you can do, stand up and fight, even when the odds are against you." It was the most he'd ever said to her at once, and Ruby understood what a gift that was. He'd shared his pain, his history, his truth. In a world where trust was rare and vulnerability dangerous, he'd given her both. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it in a way that went far beyond gratitude for a rescue. Colt nodded, something like understanding passing between them. Then he stepped back. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we find out just how hard Boone's willing to fight." Ruby closed the door and returned to bed, but this time when she lay down, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she wasn't alone. The next morning, Blackwood filed his petition. By noon, the entire town was buzzing with the news that someone was challenging Jeremiah Boone's claim to the river crossing. By evening, Boone himself arrived in Silver Creek. Ruby watched from the hotel window as he rode into town flanked by 4 hired guns and a lawyer who looked expensive enough to buy half the courthouse. Boone's face was calm, but there was a cold fury in his eyes that made Ruby's blood run cold. "He knows we're here," Colt said from behind her. "Let him know," Ruby replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I'm done hiding." That night, Boone's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss their petition and demanded that Ruby be arrested for making false claims against a legitimate property owner. Blackwood countered with evidence of the incomplete filing and a request for the judge to review all documentation before making any rulings. The legal war had begun, and Ruby stood at the center of it, no longer the frightened girl on the saloon porch, but a young woman who'd found her mother's strength and her own fierce will to fight. Whatever came next, she'd face it standing. The territorial judge arrived in Silver Creek 3 days later, a stern-faced man named Harrison Wade, who had a reputation for being incorruptible, a rarity in a territory where Boone's money had purchased the loyalty of nearly every official with authority. Blackwood had pulled strings and called in favors to ensure Wade would hear the case, and now the entire town held its breath, waiting to see if justice could survive in a place where power had always trumped truth. The preliminary hearing was set for the following Monday in the main courtroom. Ruby spent those days in a state of tense anticipation, going over her mother's journal repeatedly, memorizing every detail that might help their case. Naya worked with Blackwood to prepare testimony and gather evidence, while Colt kept watch from the shadows, his hand never far from his rifle. Boone's men were everywhere now, lingering outside the hotel, watching the courthouse, making their presence known as a silent threat. On Sunday evening, Ruby was sitting in her hotel room reviewing documents when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find a young woman standing in the hallway, her face pale and frightened. "Miss Callahan?" the woman whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. "My name is Margaret Chen. I work as a clerk in Mr. Boone's office. I need to speak with you." Ruby's instinct screamed caution, but something in the woman's desperate eyes made her step aside. "Come in quickly." Margaret slipped inside, wringing her hands. She was perhaps 25, dressed in the simple clothing of a working woman, with ink stains on her fingers that marked her as someone who spent her days copying documents and filing papers. "I shouldn't be here," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "If Mr. Boone finds out I spoke to you, he'll—" She broke off, swallowing hard. "Why did you come?" Ruby asked gently. "Because what he's doing is wrong." The words burst out of Margaret like a confession. "I was there when your father signed over his assets. Mr. Boone got him so drunk he could barely hold a pen. Thomas kept asking about his daughter, kept saying he needed to make sure you'd be taken care of, and Mr. Boone just laughed and poured him more whiskey. Your father had no idea what he was signing." Ruby's hands clenched into fists. "Can you testify to that?" "I want to, but I'm scared." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Boone has destroyed people for less. He controls half the businesses in this territory. If I speak against him, I'll never work again. My family depends on my wages." "Then why tell me at all?" Margaret met her gaze, and Ruby saw the same desperate courage she'd felt standing on that saloon porch. "Because my mother died last year. Before she passed, she told me that staying silent in the face of evil makes you part of it. I've been silent too long, Miss Callahan. I've watched Mr. Boone ruin good people, and I've said nothing. But when I heard he was going after you, a girl barely older than my sister, I couldn't—" She wiped her eyes roughly. "I couldn't be silent anymore." Ruby felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even about the river crossing. It was about everyone Boone had hurt, everyone he'd threatened, everyone who'd been too afraid to stand up. "I need to get Blackwood," Ruby said. "If you're willing to testify, we need to prepare you properly, and we need to make sure you're protected." Within an hour, they'd gathered in Blackwood's office. Ruby, Colt, Naya, Margaret, and the lawyer himself. Blackwood listened intently as Margaret recounted everything she'd witnessed, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions. "This is good," he said finally. "Very good. If you're willing to testify that Thomas Callahan was coerced into signing those documents while intoxicated and unable to understand what he was agreeing to, it undermines the entire foundation of Boone's claim. But it puts her in danger," Colt said, his voice hard. "The moment she takes that stand, Boone will know she betrayed him." "I know." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "I've made my choice." Naya leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "We can protect you. After the hearing, you come with us. We'll get you out of Silver Creek and somewhere Boone's influence doesn't reach. You'll have to start over, but you'll be alive." "And if we lose?" Margaret asked. "Then we all start over," Ruby said. "Or we keep fighting until we win." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll testify." That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the dark streets below, thinking about all the people whose lives had become entangled with hers. Margaret risking everything to tell the truth. Naya fighting to honor her mother's memory. Colt standing guard against threats he had no obligation to face. Blackwood taking on a case that could destroy his career. They were all choosing to fight when they could have walked away. The realization was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. If they lost, it wouldn't just be Ruby who suffered. It would be everyone who'd stood with her. "You're thinking too hard," Colt's voice came from the darkness behind her. Ruby turned to find him leaning in her doorway, his expression unreadable as always. "I didn't hear you knock." "I didn't." The door was open. He stepped into the room, closing it softly behind him. "You should be resting." "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see all the ways this could go wrong. She turned back to the window. Margaret could be killed for helping us. Blackwood could lose everything. And you... She stopped, unable to finish the thought. And me what? You've already given me so much. Your home, your protection, your time. And now you're standing between me and Boone's guns. Why? What do I have that's worth risking your life for? Colt was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. You have courage. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from having nothing to lose, but the kind that shows up when you have everything to lose and you stand anyway. That's rare, Ruby. Rare enough to fight for. She turned to face him, tears blurring her vision. What if I'm not as brave as you think I am? Then you fake it until you are. That's what everyone does. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the shadows in his eyes. You think I wasn't terrified when I ran from that bounty hunter? You think Naya wasn't scared when she chose to leave her people and make a life among strangers? Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite it. Ruby wiped her eyes. Frustration and fear and determination all tangled together in her chest. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to stand in front of a courtroom and face down a man like Boone. Yes, you do. You've been doing it since the moment you said no on that saloon porch. Colt's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. Tomorrow, you walk into that courtroom and you tell the truth. You look the judge in the eye and you fight for what's yours. That's all anyone can ask of you. And if we lose, then we fight again and again, until either we win or there's nothing left to fight for. His grip tightened slightly. But we won't lose. Not if I have anything to say about it. Ruby found herself leaning into that steady strength, drawing from it like water from a well. She'd spent so long believing she was alone that no one would stand with her when things got hard. But here was Colt, solid and unwavering, offering support without expecting anything in return. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded, then stepped back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow changes everything. Monday morning dawned cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over Silver Creek like a shroud. Ruby dressed in the best clothes Naya could find for her, a simple dark dress that had belonged to the trader's late sister, clean and modest and appropriate for court. She braided her hair with shaking hands, trying to quiet the chaos of thoughts racing through her mind. When she came downstairs, she found Colt, Naya, and Blackwood waiting in the hotel lobby. Colt had cleaned up, trading his usual rough frontier clothing for a dark suit that made him look almost civilized. Naya wore traditional Dakota dress, a quiet declaration that she wouldn't compromise her identity even in a white man's court. Blackwood carried a leather case stuffed with documents, his expression grim but determined. Margaret's already at the courthouse, he said. I have her sequestered in a witness room under guard. Boone doesn't know she's testifying yet. He'll figure it out fast enough, Colt said. Let him. Blackwood's jaw set. By the time he reacts, she'll already be on the stand. They walked to the courthouse together, and Ruby was struck by how many people had gathered on the steps and in the street. Word had spread that someone was finally standing up to Jeremiah Boone, and the entire territory seemed to have shown up to watch. Some faces showed support, others showed skepticism. A few showed outright hostility. And standing at the top of the courthouse steps, surrounded by his lawyers and hired guns, was Boone himself. He watched Ruby approach with that terrible smile, and when she was close enough to hear, he spoke in a voice pitched to Carrie. Miss Callahan, I do hope you've reconsidered this foolishness. There's still time to settle this matter reasonably. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the river crossing. More than it's worth, really, given the questionable nature of your claim. Ruby stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at him. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to submit, to take the easy path. But she thought of her mother's words, stay strong, stay free, and found her voice. The river crossing isn't for sale, Mr. Boone. Not to you. Not to anyone. Boone's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this like civilized people. But if you insist on making this difficult, he shrugged elegantly. Well, the courts will decide. He swept past her into the courthouse, his entourage following like a dark tide. Naya touched Ruby's arm. Don't let him rattle you. That's what he wants. Ruby nodded, trying to steady her breathing. They climbed the steps and entered the courthouse, moving through crowds of spectators who'd packed themselves into every available space. The courtroom itself was standing room only, with people pressed against the walls and craning their necks to see. Judge Wade sat behind an imposing bench at the front of the room, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the chaos. When everyone had settled as much as they were going to, he banged his gavel. This is a preliminary hearing regarding the disputed ownership of a river crossing property in the Northern Valley, he announced in a voice that cut through the murmurs. We're here to determine whether there's sufficient evidence to warrant a full trial. This is not a circus. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Is that understood? A general murmur of assent. Good. Mr. Blackwood, you filed the petition. Present your case. Blackwood stood, his movements careful and deliberate. Your Honor, my client, Miss Ruby Callahan, is the rightful owner of the disputed property through a land trust established by her late mother, Sarah Callahan. We have evidence that this trust was properly filed with this court 4 years ago, but was never processed due to administrative error. Meanwhile, Mr. Boone has obtained a fraudulent deed transfer through coercion of Miss Callahan's father, who was heavily intoxicated and unable to understand the documents he was signing. Boone's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Reynolds, shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These are serious accusations with no supporting evidence. Then let's hear the evidence, Judge Wade said dryly. Mr. Blackwood? I'd like to call my first witness, Miss Margaret Chen. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Margaret entered through a side door, her face pale but composed. Ruby saw the exact moment Boone recognized her. His expression went from smug confidence to barely controlled fury in the space of a heartbeat. He leaned over to whisper something to Reynolds, who nodded sharply. Margaret took the stand and was sworn in, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Blackwood approached her gently. Miss Chen, please tell the court your occupation. I'm a clerk in Mr. Boone's office. I handle correspondence, file documents, and maintain his business records. And in that capacity, were you present on the evening of April 15th when Thomas Callahan signed documents transferring his assets to Mr. Boone? Yes, sir, I was. Please describe what you witnessed. Margaret took a deep breath. Mr. Callahan arrived at the office around 8 in the evening. He was already intoxicated. I could smell the whiskey on him from across the room. Mr. Boone offered him more drinks, which Mr. Callahan accepted. Over the next hour, Mr. Boone presented various documents for signature. Mr. Callahan kept asking questions about his daughter, about whether she would be protected. Mr. Boone assured him she would be, but the documents made no mention of any provisions for Miss Callahan's welfare. Did Mr. Callahan seem to understand what he was signing? No, sir. He was so intoxicated he could barely hold the pen. At one point, he tried to read one of the documents and gave up, saying the words were swimming. Mr. Boone just laughed and guided his hand to sign. Reynolds leaped up. Objection! This witness is clearly biased against my client. Her testimony is, I'll determine credibility, Mr. Reynolds. Judge Wade cut him off. Continue, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Chen, why are you coming forward with this information now? Margaret looked directly at Ruby, and her voice strengthened. Because what Mr. Boone did was wrong. He's built his empire on taking advantage of desperate people, and I've been complicit by staying silent. I can't do that anymore. The courtroom was utterly silent now. Every eye was fixed on Margaret, and Ruby felt a surge of fierce pride for this woman who was risking everything to tell the truth. Blackwood nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Reynolds approached the stand like a predator circling prey. Miss Chen, isn't it true that you were recently passed over for a promotion in Mr. Boone's office? Yes, but... And isn't it true that you expressed anger about this decision to your coworkers? Margaret's jaw tightened. I was disappointed, yes, but that has nothing to do with... So you have a personal grudge against my client. Your testimony is motivated by revenge, not truth. That's not true, Margaret's voice rose. I'm testifying because I witnessed fraud, and I won't be part of it anymore. Or perhaps you're testifying because Miss Callahan offered you money to lie on her behalf. Objection, Blackwood roared. Counsel is making baseless accusations. Sustained, Judge Wade said sharply. Mr. Reynolds, if you have actual evidence of witness tampering, present it. Otherwise, move on." Reynolds smiled thinly. No further questions. Margaret stepped down, her face flushed but her composure intact. As she passed Ruby's table, she gave a small nod that Ruby returned with gratitude. Blackwood called his next witness, a records clerk from the courthouse who confirmed that Sarah Callahan had indeed filed documents 4 years ago, but that they'd been flagged for review and never processed. The clerk couldn't explain why, only that the notation suggested some question about their validity. "Who would have reviewed these documents?" Blackwood asked. "The territorial assessor at the time, a man named Cyrus Marsh." "And where's Mr. Marsh now?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "He left his position 2 years ago, moved to California, I believe." "How convenient," Blackwood said dryly. "Did Mr. Marsh have any business relationships with Mr. Boone?" Reynolds objected before the clerk could answer, and Judge Wade sustained it, but the implication hung in the air. Boone had been manipulating the system for years, ensuring that challenges to his power were buried in bureaucracy and red tape. When it was Reynolds' turn to present Boone's case, he brought forth a parade of witnesses who testified to Thomas Callahan's gambling debts, his chronic drunkenness, and his desperate need for money. Each one painted a picture of a man who'd willingly sold everything he owned to cover his losses. The fact is, Reynolds argued, Thomas Callahan had legal authority to dispose of his assets as he saw fit. Whether he was drunk or sober is irrelevant. The documents were properly executed and filed. My client's claim is legitimate. "What about the land trust established by Sarah Callahan?" Blackwood countered. "That predates any agreement between Thomas Callahan and your client." "A trust that was never properly processed," Reynolds shot back. "Without valid documentation, it doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. Mr. Boone's claim is clear, recorded, and uncontested by any legal instrument." The arguments went back and forth for hours. Ruby sat at the defense table, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles went white. She watched Judge Wade's face for any sign of which way he was leaning, but the man was inscrutable. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows, Blackwood played his final card. "Your Honor, I have one more witness. I'd like to call Miss Ruby Callahan to the stand." Ruby's heart hammered as she stood and walked to the witness box. Every eye in the courtroom followed her, and she felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. When she placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, she thought of her mother and drew strength from that memory. Blackwood approached her with a gentle expression. "Miss Callahan, please tell the court about your mother's final days." Ruby's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "She was very sick with fever. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. In those last days, she kept trying to tell me something about land, about a legacy she'd protected for me. I didn't understand at the time. I was only 14, and I was terrified of losing her." "Did she mention the river crossing specifically?" "Yes. She said it was mine, that she'd made sure my father couldn't take it away. She said I should find Naya Red Elk if anything happened, that Naya would help me." Ruby's voice cracked. "She died before she could explain everything. And my father never told me about the crossing. He kept it secret while he gambled away everything else we had." "When did you learn about the land trust?" "A few weeks ago, when Naya showed me my mother's journal. That's when I discovered what my mother had done to protect me." Blackwood held up the journal. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this as evidence. It clearly documents Sarah Callahan's intent to establish a trust for her daughter's benefit." Reynolds objected, but Judge Wade overruled him and accepted the journal into evidence. Ruby watched as the judge leafed through the pages, his stern expression softening slightly as he read her mother's words. Then it was Reynolds' turn. He approached Ruby with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Callahan, isn't it true that you ran away from your father several weeks ago?" "I didn't run away. I was being sold on a saloon porch, and someone gave me a choice to leave." "Sold?" Reynolds said the word like it tasted bad. "That's a very dramatic way to describe your father trying to settle his debts." "It's the truth," Ruby said flatly. "Or perhaps it's how you justify abandoning your father in his time of need. Tell me, Miss Callahan, did you ever try to help your father overcome his gambling problem? Did you try to support him after your mother's death?" Ruby's hand shook with anger. "I was 14 years old when my mother died. I tried to keep our household together while my father drank himself unconscious every night. I tried to make our money last when he gambled it away. I tried to keep us from starving when he disappeared for days at a time. Don't you dare suggest I abandoned him." "But you did leave him, because he was selling me like livestock," Ruby's voice rang through the courtroom. "Because he was so drunk he couldn't see what he was doing. Because staying would have meant becoming property of whoever bid the highest. So yes, I left, and I don't regret it." Reynolds paused, clearly not expecting such a forceful response. He recovered quickly. "Isn't it true that you're only making this claim to the river crossing now that you know it's valuable? That you had no interest in it until Mr. Boone's involvement made it a prize worth fighting for?" "I didn't even know it existed until a few weeks ago," Ruby said. "My mother kept it secret to protect it from my father. She died before she could tell me. But now that I do know, yes, I'm fighting for it. Not because it's valuable, but because it was hers. Because she fought to give me something that couldn't be taken away. And I won't let men like you and Boone turn her sacrifice into just another piece of property to be bought and sold." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Wade banged his gavel, calling for order. Reynolds tried a few more questions, but Ruby stood firm, refusing to be intimidated or trapped into contradictions. When he finally dismissed her, she walked back to her seat with her head high, feeling like she'd left a piece of her fear on that witness stand. Judge Wade called a recess to review the evidence. Ruby, Colt, Naya, and Blackwood retreated to a small room to wait. The minutes stretched like hours. Ruby paced while Colt stood guard at the door and Naya sat in silent meditation. "You did well," Blackwood said. "Better than well. You didn't let Reynolds shake you." "Will it be enough?" Ruby asked. "Honestly, I don't know. Wade is fair, but the law isn't always on the side of justice. We've shown reasonable doubt about Boone's claim and strong evidence of your mother's intent, but without those original trust documents," he shrugged helplessly. Before anyone could respond, the bailiff knocked on the door. "Judge Wade is ready with his ruling." They filed back into the courtroom, which had somehow grown even more crowded during the recess. Ruby's heart hammered as she took her seat. Across the aisle, Boone sat with perfect composure, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Judge Wade entered and sat, his expression giving nothing away. He picked up a sheaf of papers and looked out over the courtroom. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today," he began. "This is a complex case involving questions of legal standing, administrative process, and conflicting claims. However, certain facts are clear. First, Sarah Callahan did attempt to file a land trust with this court 4 years ago. Whether that filing was properly executed is a matter requiring further investigation. Second, there's credible testimony suggesting that Thomas Callahan was coerced into signing documents while heavily intoxicated. Third, Miss Ruby Callahan has presented a compelling case that her mother intended the river crossing to be held in trust for her benefit." He paused, and Ruby held her breath. "However, intent alone is not sufficient under territorial law. Without the original trust documents, I cannot simply invalidate Mr. Boone's deed transfer. That said, I also cannot ignore the serious irregularities in how that transfer was obtained." Wade's gaze sharpened. "Therefore, I am ordering the following. First, a temporary injunction preventing Mr. Boone from restricting access to the river crossing until this matter is fully resolved. Second, a complete audit of the territorial land records to locate the original trust documents filed by Sarah Callahan. Third, a full trial to be scheduled within 60 days to determine the rightful ownership of the disputed property." The courtroom exploded in noise. Some people cheered. Others shouted objections. Boone's face had gone dark with fury. Wade banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I'm not finished!" When the room quieted, he continued. "I'm also ordering an investigation into potential witness coercion and fraud in the execution of the deed transfer between Thomas Callahan and Jeremiah Boone. If evidence of criminal conduct is found, charges will be filed. This hearing is adjourned." Ruby sat in stunned silence as chaos erupted around her. They hadn't won, but they hadn't lost either. The fight would continue, but for now, the river crossing remained accessible to everyone. Boone's stranglehold had been checked. Blackwood was grinning. "It's not a victory, but it's damn close. Wade's basically told Boone he's under investigation. That's more than I dared hope for." Naya embraced Ruby fiercely. "Your mother would be so proud." But as they celebrated, Ruby looked across the courtroom and met Boone's eyes. The rage she saw there was cold and calculated. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And the war that was coming would make this legal battle look like a minor skirmish. They left Silver Creek the next morning before dawn, moving fast and staying alert. Blackwood had warned them that Boone wouldn't take the judge's ruling quietly, and the lawyer's instincts proved correct before they'd even cleared the town limits. Two of Boone's men followed them on horseback, keeping a careful distance but making no attempt to hide their presence. "They're not trying to catch us," Colt said quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. "They're tracking where we go." "Let them track," Naya replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We're heading back to my trading post first. Once we're there, we'll have the advantage of familiar ground." Margaret rode between Ruby and Naya, her face pale but determined. She'd given up everything to testify: her job, her home, her safety. Now she was trusting strangers to protect her from a man who'd proven he could reach anywhere in the territory. "Do you think he'll really come after us?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Without question," Colt said flatly. "Judge Wade's ruling humiliated him in front of the whole territory. Men like Boone don't forgive that. They retaliate." Ruby felt the weight of that truth settle in her chest. She'd wanted to fight, wanted to stand up for what was right. But she hadn't fully understood that fighting meant putting everyone around her in danger. Now Margaret was a target because of her. Colt and Naya were targets because of her. Even Blackwood, who'd stayed in Silver Creek to begin the records audit, was at risk. The guilt was almost unbearable. As if sensing her thoughts, Naya reached over and touched her arm. "Don't," the older woman said firmly. "Don't carry that weight. We all made our choices with open eyes. No one forced us to stand with you. But if something happens to any of you, then we'll deal with it together." Naya's voice was steel wrapped in kindness. "That's what family does." The word hit Ruby like a physical blow. Family. She'd lost her mother, been betrayed by her father, and spent years believing she was utterly alone in the world. Now this fierce Dakota woman was claiming her as kin, and the emotion that surged through Ruby was so powerful she had to look away to hide the tears. They rode in tense silence for the rest of the morning, the two trackers maintaining their distant surveillance. By midday, they'd reached rougher country where the trails narrowed and the forest pressed close on both sides. Colt called a halt near a stream to water the horses. "We need to lose our shadows," he said, studying the terrain. "If they follow us all the way to Naya's post, they'll know where to find us. We need to disappear." "There's a canyon about 2 miles north," Naya said. "Multiple trails branch off inside it. We could split up, confuse the tracking." "Too risky," Colt countered. "If we split up, we're vulnerable. Better to stay together and use the terrain to our advantage." Ruby listened to them debate strategy, feeling useless. She could shoot a rifle now and handle a horse, but tactical planning was beyond her experience. She hated feeling like dead weight. "What if we confront them?" she said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at her. "What if we stop running and ask them what they want?" Ruby continued, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "They're following us, not attacking. Maybe Boone just wants to talk. Maybe we can—" "No." Colt's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Boone doesn't want to talk. He wants to intimidate, isolate, and eliminate. The moment we show weakness, he'll exploit it." "I'm not suggesting we show weakness. I'm suggesting we show strength." Ruby's pulse quickened. "What if we ride straight to the river crossing, the place everyone's fighting over? We make it clear we're not hiding, we're not running, and we're not afraid of him." Naya's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That's bold, reckless, but bold." "It's suicide," Colt said flatly. "Is it?" Ruby challenged. "Judge Wade issued an injunction. The crossing is supposed to remain open to everyone. If Boone's men are there blocking access, we can report them for violating a court order. If they're not there, we've made our point and established our presence. Either way, we're not acting like prey." Margaret looked terrified. "Mr. Boone has more than 2 men working for him. If we go to the crossing, we could be walking into a trap." "Then we go prepared for a trap," Ruby said. "We go in daylight with witnesses. We make it public. Boone operates in shadows and back rooms. Let's drag this fight into the open where everyone can see." Colt studied her face for a long moment, and Ruby saw something shift in his expression, surprise mixed with what might have been respect. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I've learned from watching you." Ruby met his gaze steadily. "You don't run from threats. You face them head on and make people understand the cost of crossing you. I'm done being the scared girl everyone thinks they can push around." Naya laughed, the sound sharp and approving. Sarah's daughter, indeed. All right, Ruby Callahan, we go to the crossing, but we do it smart. We bring witnesses from the nearby ranches. We make this an event Boone can't sweep under the rug. It took them 2 hours to reach the nearest homesteads and gather support. Ruby had expected resistance, expected people to be too afraid of Boone to stand with her. But something had changed after the courthouse hearing. Word had spread that someone had finally challenged the man who'd terrorized the territory for years and lived to tell about it. The first ranch they visited belonged to a weathered couple named Samuel and Martha Price. They'd been trying to make a living on scrubland for 15 years, and the river crossing was their lifeline. Boone's been squeezing us for months, Samuel said, his calloused hands clenched into fists. Raised the prices at his store, called in loans he told us we could pay back over time, threatened to cut off our water access if we didn't sell him our land at a fraction of what it's worth. We've been hanging on by our fingernails. If you're going to the crossing, we're going with you, Martha added. Her face was lined with hard years, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. It's time somebody stood up to that devil. At the next ranch, they found a young couple with 3 small children. The husband, Daniel Garrett, had once worked for Boone and still bore scars from the experience. He had his men beat me when I asked for wages he owed, Daniel said, lifting his shirt to show purple bruises that had faded to yellow. Said I was lucky he didn't kill me for being disrespectful. I've kept my head down since then, tried to keep my family safe, but if there's a chance to fight back, I'll take it. By the time they reached the river crossing, they had 12 people with them, ranchers, homesteaders, and working families who'd suffered under Boone's control and were ready to reclaim what was theirs. The crossing itself was a wide, shallow point in the river where the water flowed clear over smooth stones. On both banks, trails converged from different directions, creating a natural hub for the scattered ranches and settlements. It was beautiful country, lush and green, fed by the mountain snowmelt that made the valley fertile. And standing in the middle of the crossing were 5 of Boone's hired guns. They'd built a makeshift checkpoint, logs and ropes stretched across the shallowest part of the river with a crude sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." The men themselves looked exactly like what they were. Hardened killers paid to intimidate anyone who challenged their employer's claim. Ruby felt her courage waver as they approached. These weren't lawyers or clerks or bureaucrats who could be reasoned with. These were men who solved problems with violence. But then she thought of her mother's journal, of Margaret's testimony, of Judge Wade's ruling. The law was on their side. The truth was on their side. And fear had controlled her for too long. "That's far enough," one of Boone's men called out. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a scar running down his cheek and a revolver prominent on his hip. "This is private property. Turn around." Colt guided his horse forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Ruby. "Judge Wade issued an injunction 3 days ago keeping this crossing open to public access. You're in violation of a court order." The scarred man spat into the river. "Don't care about your court order. Mr. Boone owns this land now, and he says no one crosses without paying a toll." "The court says different," Naya said, her voice carrying authority. "And unless you want to be arrested for contempt, you'll remove that barrier and let these people through." One of the other gunmen laughed. "Arrest us? You in what army, old woman?" "This army." The voice came from behind them. Ruby turned to see more people approaching, at least 20 ranchers and settlers on horseback and on foot, drawn by the news that someone was finally standing up to Boone. Among them was Samuel Price's son leading a group of young men who'd grown up working land that Boone had tried to steal from their families. The scarred gunman's confidence flickered. He'd been prepared to intimidate a small group. Facing down 30 angry settlers was a different proposition. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his hand had moved away from his gun. Mr. Boone is not the law," Ruby said, urging her horse forward before her courage could fail. "This land belongs to everyone in this valley. Your employer is trying to steal what generations of families built together. Well, we're taking it back." She dismounted and walked straight toward the barrier. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to let someone else take the risk. But she kept walking, her boots splashing through the shallow water. The scarred man tensed. "I'm warning you." "You'll what?" Ruby stopped directly in front of him. "Shoot an unarmed woman in front of 30 witnesses? Attack people for using water that's legally accessible? Your employer might be rich enough to buy corrupt officials, but he's not rich enough to escape murder charges witnessed by this many people. Behind her, the crowd pressed forward. Not threatening, not violent, but present. An undeniable wall of humanity reclaiming what was theirs. The standoff lasted an eternity that was probably only seconds. The gunmen looked at each other, calculating odds and consequences. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and operating outside the law. Even men who made their living through violence understood when the equation had shifted against them. Finally, the scarred man stepped back. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Ruby's voice was steady even though her hands shook. The judge ruled, "The law is clear. Tell Mr. Boone that if he wants this land, he'll have to fight for it in court, not through intimidation and hired guns." The gunmen withdrew slowly, mounting their horses and riding off without removing the barrier. But their departure was admission enough. The moment they were out of sight, Samuel and Daniel moved forward and tore down the barrier themselves, throwing the logs and rope onto the riverbank. A cheer went up from the crowd. People splashed into the water, some filling canteens, others just standing in the current to mark their reclaimed access. Ruby felt hands clapping her shoulders, heard voices praising her courage, saw tears in Martha Price's eyes. "You did it," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You actually stood up to them." Ruby looked at Colt, seeking his reaction. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, pride mixed with concern, mixed with something deeper that made her heart skip. "That was brave," he said quietly. "Also incredibly dangerous. You're the one who taught me that sometimes you have to face threats head on. I also taught you to pick battles you can win." His voice was gentle but firm. "This was a victory, Ruby. But it's also a declaration of war. Boone will retaliate, and next time he won't send 5 men with orders to intimidate. He'll send everything he has." The celebration around them continued, but Colt's words cast a shadow over Ruby's triumph. He was right. They'd won this moment, but the real battle was just beginning. That night, they made camp on Naya's property with guards posted in shifts. The ranchers who'd stood with them at the crossing had promised to spread the word, to organize their neighbors, to form a network of mutual protection against Boone's inevitable response. It was the beginning of something larger than Ruby had anticipated. Not just a fight over one piece of land, but a grassroots rebellion against a system that had kept good people trapped in fear for years. Ruby couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire long after everyone else had retired, staring into the flames and thinking about everything that had happened. In the space of a few weeks, she'd gone from being sold on a saloon porch to leading a confrontation that could reshape the entire territory. The transformation felt surreal. "You should rest." Colt emerged from the darkness and settled beside her. "Tomorrow, we need to plan our next move." "What if there is no next move?" Ruby said quietly. "What if we've already pushed as far as we can and Boone just breaks us?" "Then we pick up the pieces and push again." Colt fed another log to the fire. "That's how change happens. Not in one dramatic victory, but in 1,000 small acts of resistance that eventually add up to something unstoppable." "Is that what you did? After you escaped?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I tried to disappear. Tried to build a life where no one could touch me, where I didn't have to care about anyone or anything except surviving. It worked for a while. Then I realized that isolation isn't freedom. It's just another kind of prison." "What changed?" "Your mother, actually." Colt's voice softened. "When I first came to this territory, I was angry and broken and didn't trust anyone. Sarah treated me with kindness I didn't think I deserved. Invited me to dinner, shared food when I had none, never asked questions about my past. She just saw me as human. It sounds simple, but after what I'd been through, it was everything." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish I'd known her better. Really known her, not just as my mother, but as the person she was." She was complicated, strong and scared, brave and wounded, hopeful and grieving all at the same time. Colt stared into the fire. "She loved you more than anything in this world. Every choice she made, every secret she kept was about protecting you. Don't ever doubt that." "I don't. Not anymore." Ruby wiped her eyes. "But I wish she could see what we're building here. This network of people standing together. She'd be proud, wouldn't she?" "She'd be terrified," Colt said honestly. But yes, she'd also be proud. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Ruby found herself acutely aware of Colt's presence beside her, the warmth of his shoulder nearly touching hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet strength that radiated from him like heat from the coals. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For saving me, for standing with me, for believing I could be more than what everyone else saw." Colt turned to look at her, and in the firelight, his eyes were dark and unreadable. "You were always more, Ruby. You just needed the chance to prove it." Something electric passed between them in that moment, a recognition of partnership that had grown into something deeper without either of them quite noticing. Ruby felt it in the way her breath caught, in the sudden awareness of how close they were sitting, in the desire to close that small distance and see what happened. But before she could act on the impulse, a shout came from the darkness. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" They leaped to their feet and ran toward Naya's barn, where flames were already licking up the wooden walls. People poured out of the main house in various states of undress, grabbing buckets and forming a water line from the well. The fire spread fast, feeding on dry wood and old hay. "Everyone out!" Naya shouted. "Let the barn go. Just keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings." They fought for hours, drenching the surrounding structures and creating fire breaks to contain the blaze. By the time they got it under control, the barn was a blackened skeleton, and everyone was covered in soot and ash. "This wasn't an accident," Colt said, examining the perimeter. "Look here. Oil splashed on the walls. This was arson." Ruby felt cold fury settle in her chest. Boone had sent a message. "You humiliated me at the crossing. Now you'll pay." "We need to strike back," Daniel Garrett said, his fists clenched. "Go to Salvation Ridge and burn down his saloon. Show him he can't terrorize us without consequences." "No," Ruby's voice cut through the angry murmurs. "That's what he wants. He wants us to become criminals so he can claim we're the lawless ones. We won't give him that satisfaction." "Then what do we do?" Martha Price demanded. "Just let him burn our homes?" "We document everything." Ruby's mind raced. "We take this evidence to Judge Wade. We show him that Boone is violating the injunction and engaging in criminal destruction. We use the law against him, not violence." "The law hasn't protected us so far," someone muttered. "Because we haven't forced it to," Ruby countered. "We've been isolated, scattered, too afraid to stand together. But that's changing. We have witnesses now. We have evidence. And we have each other. Boone thrives in darkness and fear, so we drag everything into the light." Naya stepped forward, her face smudged with ash, but her expression fierce. "Ruby's right. We fight this smart. We gather evidence of every attack, every threat, every crime Boone commits. We build a case so airtight that even corrupt officials can't ignore it. And in 60 days when we go to trial, we bury him." The crowd murmured agreement, anger transforming into determination. They spent the rest of the night documenting the arson scene, taking measurements, collecting samples of the oil used, recording testimony from everyone who'd seen the fire start. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the barn, Ruby stood with Colt and Naya surveying the damage. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," Naya said quietly. "I know," Ruby's jaw set, "but we're not backing down." Over the next 3 weeks, Boone's attacks escalated. Fences were cut, letting livestock wander into dangerous terrain. Wells were poisoned, forcing families to haul water from miles away. Crops were trampled in the night by riders who disappeared before they could be caught. Each attack was designed to break morale and drive people back into fearful submission. But something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, the community grew stronger. Families who'd barely spoken to each other for years began coordinating their defenses. Young men formed patrol groups to watch for suspicious activity. Women organized supply networks to help those who'd lost crops or livestock. The scattered settlers of the valley were becoming an actual community, bound together by shared hardship and shared resistance. Ruby found herself at the center of it all, not because she sought leadership, but because people saw in her something they desperately needed. She was proof that standing up to Boone was possible, that courage could be found even in the most unlikely places, that change could start with one person saying no. Blackwood sent regular updates from Silver Creek. The records audit was progressing slowly, hampered by missing documents and bureaucratic obstacles. But he'd found evidence of corruption in the territorial assessor's office, proof that Cyrus Marsh had been on Boone's payroll and had deliberately buried Sarah's land trust filing. It wasn't enough to overturn Boone's claim outright, but it established a pattern of fraud that would be damaging in court. Meanwhile, Margaret had proven invaluable. Her knowledge of Boone's business operations gave them insights into his network of intimidation and control. She helped them identify which officials were in his pocket and which might be swayed to neutrality. She taught Ruby how to read legal documents and spot the tricks lawyers use to bury truth in jargon. "You're a natural at this," Margaret said one evening as they reviewed depositions together. "You see through the smoke to the core issue. That's a rare skill." "I had good teachers," Ruby replied. "My mother, Naya, you, everyone who's stood with me." "We stand with you because you're worth standing for," Margaret said firmly. "Don't ever forget that." As the trial date approached, tensions in the valley reached a breaking point. Boone's men had injured 2 ranchers in separate incidents, though both attacks were cleverly staged to look like accidents. The territorial marshal, a man deeply in Boone's pocket, refused to investigate. Then, 5 days before the trial, everything changed. A rider came to Naya's post at midnight, his horse lathered from hard riding. Ruby was still awake, going over testimony with Colt, when they heard the commotion outside. The rider was one of Samuel Price's sons, and his face was ashen with terror. "They took my father," he gasped. "Boone's men grabbed him from our barn tonight, said he was trespassing on Boone's land and they're holding him for the marshal, but Pa wasn't on anyone's land but ours. This is a lie, a trap. Is he—" "No." "Where did they take him?" Colt demanded. "Salvation Ridge, the saloon. They've got him locked in the back room." Ruby's blood ran cold. This was Boone's endgame. Kidnap someone beloved in the community, manufacture false charges, and force everyone to back down from the trial or watch an innocent man hang. "We're going after him," she said immediately. "Ruby, no." Naya gripped her arm. "That's exactly what Boone wants. He's trying to provoke us into doing something reckless that will undermine our legal case." "I don't care. We can't let Samuel rot in that saloon while we hide behind legal procedures." Colt stepped between them. "We can do both. Ruby and I will go to Salvation Ridge and negotiate Samuel's release. The rest of you continue preparing for trial. If we're not back in 2 days, proceed without us." "Absolutely not," Naya said sharply. "You'll both be killed." "Maybe." Colt's voice was calm. "But I've faced worse odds. And Ruby's right. We can't abandon Samuel. If we do, every other person in this valley will know they're expendable. We'll lose the coalition we've built." Ruby met his eyes and saw her own determination reflected back. "We leave in an hour." The ride to Salvation Ridge took most of the night. They pushed the horses hard, knowing that every moment Samuel spent in Boone's custody increased the danger. As they rode through the darkness, Ruby thought about the last time she'd seen this town, trembling on a saloon porch while her father sold her future for gambling debts. She'd been powerless then, terrified and alone. Now she was riding back armed and allied with people who'd become family. The girl who'd needed rescuing was gone. In her place was someone who rescued others. They reached the outskirts of Salvation Ridge just before dawn, the sky turning gray with approaching light. The town was quiet, most people still asleep. The Broken Wheel Saloon stood dark and silent at the end of the main street. "We go in through the back," Colt said, dismounting. "Quiet and careful. Our goal is to get Samuel out without bloodshed." But as they approached the back entrance, the door swung open. Jeremiah Boone stood in the doorway, perfectly dressed despite the early hour, smiling that terrible smile. "Miss Callahan," he said pleasantly, "I've been expecting you." Ruby's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle slung across her back, but Colt's fingers closed around her wrist in warning. 6 of Boone's hired guns materialized from the shadows around them, weapons drawn and aimed with deadly precision. They'd walk straight into the trap. Now, Boone said, his voice dripping with false civility. "Let's not do anything hasty. You came here to negotiate for Mr. Price's release, didn't you? Well, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Come inside where we can discuss terms like civilized people." "Where's Samuel?" Ruby demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Safe and unharmed. For now." Boone gestured toward the saloon's interior. "Please, I insist." Colt's jaw was tight, but he released Ruby's wrist and raised his hand slowly. They had no choice. fighting would get them both killed, and Samuel would remain captive. Ruby followed his lead, moving through the door with Boone's guns at their backs. The saloon's back room was exactly as she remembered from the nightmares that still occasionally woke her. Dim, smoke-stained, reeking of whiskey and desperation. Samuel Price sat bound to a chair in the corner, his face bruised but his eyes fierce with defiance. He met Ruby's gaze and shook his head slightly, as if warning her not to do anything foolish for his sake. Boone settled into a chair behind a scarred wooden table, every movement calculated to project control. His men positioned themselves around the room, creating a cage of violence waiting to be unleashed. "Let me explain your situation," Boone began, steepling his fingers. "In 4 days, we go to trial. You have witnesses, evidence, and a sympathetic judge. You might even win, but here's what happens if you do. Samuel Price hangs for trespassing and assault on my men. We have 3 witnesses ready to swear he attacked them unprovoked. Every family in this valley who supported you will find their land foreclosed, their credit destroyed, their businesses ruined. I have the resources to wage economic war for years. You have what? Moral righteousness? We have the truth," Ruby said. Boone laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "The truth is whatever people with power say it is. You should have learned that by now." He leaned forward. "But I'm not unreasonable. I'm prepared to offer you a compromise. Drop the legal challenge, sign over the river crossing to me. In exchange, Samuel goes free, I leave your friends alone, and I'll even give you enough money to start over somewhere far from here. Everyone wins. Except the valley full of families who need that water," Colt said quietly. "They'll pay for access, a reasonable toll. They'll survive." Boone's eyes hardened. "But you need to understand something. I will own that crossing. The only question is whether I get it through your cooperation or through your destruction. Choose wisely." Ruby looked at Samuel, saw the silent plea in his eyes to walk away, to save herself. She looked at Colt, saw the tension in his body as he calculated their chances in a fight they couldn't win. She thought about her mother's journal, about all the people who'd stood with her, about Margaret's courage and Naya's faith and the community they'd built from fear and hope. Then she thought about the girl on the saloon porch, and she made her choice. No. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Boone's smile faded. "I'm sorry?" he said, his voice dangerous. "I said no." Ruby's voice grew stronger. "You can threaten us, hurt us, maybe even kill us, but you can't make us surrender what we've built. That river crossing belongs to the people of this valley. My mother died protecting it. Samuel's family has worked this land for 15 years. Colt survived things worse than you to find freedom here. We don't give up what matters just because you're powerful enough to make us suffer." Boone stood slowly, his face darkening with rage. "You stupid girl. You have no idea what you've just done." "Yes, I do." Ruby met his gaze without flinching. "I've chosen to fight. Whatever comes next, at least I'll know I didn't kneel." For a long moment, the room balanced on the edge of violence. Boone's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. His men tensed, fingers curling around triggers. Ruby felt Colt shift beside her, preparing to move even though movement meant death. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "That's far enough, Boone." Everyone turned toward the doorway where Naya Red Elk stood, flanked by Blackwood and the territorial marshal, not the corrupt official Ruby had expected, but a different man, older and wearing a badge that gleamed with legitimate authority. "Marshal Garrett," Boone said smoothly, his rage vanishing behind a mask of civility. "This is a private matter. These people trespassed on my property." "That's Acting Marshal Garrett," the man corrected. "The previous marshal has been removed from office pending investigation into corruption charges. Judge Wade appointed me yesterday." He surveyed the room with hard eyes. "And this doesn't look like a private matter. This looks like kidnapping and unlawful detention." Blackwood stepped forward, holding up a sheaf of papers. "We have statements from 4 witnesses who saw Mr. Price being forcibly abducted from his own property by men in your employ. We also have documentation of the arson at Naya Red Elk's trading post, the poisoning of 3 separate wells, and intimidation of witnesses in an ongoing legal case. Judge Wade has issued warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in these crimes." Boone's face went white, then red. "This is absurd. I'm a respected businessman. You can't—" "I can, and I am." Marshal Garrett's hand rested on his gun. You and your men are under arrest. You'll be held in Silver Creek until trial. And if I find out you've harmed one hair on any of these people's heads, I'll add attempted murder to the charges." The room erupted in chaos. Boone's men looked at each other uncertainly, weighing their loyalty against the prospect of hanging. One of them, the scarred man from the river crossing, slowly raised his hands. "I ain't dying for you, Boone," he said flatly. "I hired on to intimidate folks, not commit murder in front of a territorial marshal." The others followed his lead, dropping their weapons with expressions of surly resignation. Boone stood frozen, his world crumbling around him with a speed that clearly shocked him. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," Ruby said quietly. "It is." Marshal Garrett and his deputies took Boone and his men into custody while Colt freed Samuel from his bonds. The older rancher's legs nearly buckled when he stood, but his voice was strong. "You shouldn't have come for me," he said to Ruby. "You should have stayed safe and prepared for trial." "We don't leave family behind," Ruby replied, surprised by how naturally the word came now. "That's what makes us different from him." Outside the saloon, dawn had fully broken, painting Salvation Ridge in shades of gold and rose. A crowd had gathered in the street, many of the same people who'd watched Ruby's humiliation weeks ago. But their expressions had changed. Now they looked at her with something like awe. Naya pulled Ruby aside as the prisoners were loaded into a wagon. "We found them," the older woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The original trust documents. They were misfiled in the territorial archives under the wrong date. Blackwood discovered them 2 days ago while doing the audit. They're complete, properly executed, and they prove beyond any doubt that the river crossing belongs to you." Ruby felt the world tilt. "We won? Not yet. But we will." Naya's smile was fierce. "Boone's arrest changes everything. Without him orchestrating delays and bribing officials, the case will move forward cleanly. Judge Wade has moved the trial date up. We go to court tomorrow." Tomorrow. One more day, and this would finally be over. They rode back to Naya's post in a state of exhausted elation, picking up more supporters along the way as word spread of Boone's arrest. By the time they arrived, nearly 40 people had gathered, families who'd suffered under Boone's control and now dared to hope for justice. Ruby spent that evening going over her testimony with Blackwood one final time. The lawyer was meticulous, preparing her for every possible question, every trap the defense might set. But he also seemed confident in a way he hadn't been before. "The documents are ironclad," he said. "Your mother was careful. She had Naya witness the trust creation, filed it properly, and even paid the registration fees. The only reason it wasn't processed was because Marsh deliberately buried it. With him gone and the evidence clear, there's no legal ground for Boone's claim to stand on." "What about the criminal charges?" Ruby asked. "Those will be handled separately. But between the kidnapping, arson, witness intimidation, and the corruption evidence, Boone's going to prison for a long time. His empire is finished." That night, Ruby couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion. She walked outside and found Colt standing guard, as he had so many nights before, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Can't rest?" he asked as she settled beside him. "Too much in my head." Ruby pulled her coat tighter against the chill. "I keep thinking about how different everything is now. Weeks ago, I was standing on that saloon porch believing my life was over. And now? Now you're about to own one of the most valuable pieces of land in the territory, and you've organized a grassroots resistance movement that toppled a corrupt empire." Colt's voice carried a note of pride. "Not bad for a few weeks' work." Ruby laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy she hadn't known existed inside her. "When you say it like that, it sounds almost impressive." "It is impressive. You're impressive." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. "I want you to know something. When I paid for your freedom that day, I didn't expect anything. I didn't expect you to become this. Someone who fights for others the way you fight. Someone who sees people in pain and refuses to look away." "I learned from watching you," Ruby said softly. "Maybe. But you took those lessons and made them into something better than what I showed you. You built community where I built isolation. You chose connection where I chose distance." His hand found hers in the darkness. "You're extraordinary, Ruby Callahan. And whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. She'd been so focused on survival and justice that she hadn't let herself fully acknowledge what had been growing between them. But now, in this quiet moment before the final battle, she couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't have done any of this without you, she said. You gave me the space to find my strength. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And you stood beside me even when it would have been easier to walk away. I'm not walking away, Colt said quietly. Not now. Not ever. If you'll have me. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a question all at once. Ruby thought about everything they'd been through, every moment of trust built and courage shared. She thought about the future stretching ahead of them, uncertain and dangerous and full of possibility. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both half afraid this fragile thing between them might shatter. But then Colt's hand came up to cup her face, and Ruby's fingers tangled in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something fierce and certain and absolutely right. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ruby saw everything she felt reflected in his eyes. Love, partnership, home. Yes, she whispered. I'll have you. They sat together through the rest of the night, hands entwined, watching the stars wheel overhead and the darkness slowly give way to dawn. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Ruby felt something settle in her chest. Tomorrow they would go to court. Tomorrow they would face Boone's lawyers and fight for justice. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, right now, she was exactly where she belonged. The courthouse in Silver Creek was packed to capacity for the trial. Every seat was filled, people stood against the walls, and more crowded the hallway outside, hoping to hear news. The entire territory had turned out to watch the final confrontation between the girl who'd been sold like livestock and the man who'd terrorized them all for years. Judge Wade called the court to order with sharp raps of his gavel. Boone sat at the defense table in chains, his expensive suit rumpled and his face haggard. His lawyer, Reynolds, looked equally worn down. The weight of the criminal charges had clearly taken its toll. Blackwood presented his case with devastating precision. He entered Sarah Callahan's trust documents into evidence, called the territorial archivist who'd found them, and established beyond any doubt that they'd been properly filed 4 years ago. He presented testimony from Naya about Sarah's intentions. He showed the court evidence of Marcia's corruption and Boone's systematic efforts to bury the truth. Reynolds tried to mount a defense, but every argument crumbled under scrutiny. The documents were legitimate. The timeline was clear. Boone's claim was based on a transfer from a man who had no legal right to transfer property held in trust for his daughter. Then Blackwood called Ruby to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head high, wearing the same dark dress she'd worn to the preliminary hearing. But she felt different now, stronger. No longer the frightened girl seeking permission to exist, but a young woman claiming her rightful place in the world. Miss Callahan, Blackwood began gently, tell the court what the river crossing means to you. Ruby took a breath and spoke from her heart. It means my mother loved me enough to fight for my future when I was too young to fight for myself. It means the families in our valley have a place where they can access water without begging permission from men who see them as resources to exploit. It means that power doesn't always belong to the richest or cruelest person in the territory. Sometimes it belongs to people who are willing to stand together and say enough. She looked directly at Boone as she continued. My mother was extraordinary. She came from nothing, survived everything this harsh land threw at her, and still found the strength to protect her daughter's future. She deserves to have her legacy honored, and every person in this valley deserves to build their lives without fear of someone like you stealing what they've worked for. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Reynolds seemed to have no response to the raw honesty in her words. Judge Wade called a brief recess to review the evidence one final time. Ruby sat with Colt, Naya, and Blackwood, her hands shaking with nervous energy. So close now, so close to the finish line. When court reconvened, Judge Wade's expression was grave but certain. I've reviewed all the evidence presented, he began. The law in this case is clear. Sarah Callahan established a valid trust, naming her daughter Ruby as the sole beneficiary. That trust was properly executed and filed with this court, though it was not processed due to actions that appear to be criminal in nature. Thomas Callahan had no legal authority to transfer property held in trust, and therefore his deed to Jeremiah Boone is void. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Wade banged his gavel for silence. Furthermore, the evidence of coercion, fraud, and intimidation presented in this case is overwhelming. Mr. Boone, you have abused your position in this territory to enrich yourself at the expense of honest, hardworking families. You have corrupted officials, destroyed property, and attempted to subvert the legal process. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ruby Callahan, and awards her full ownership of the river crossing property as established by her mother's trust. The courtroom erupted. People cheered and embraced. Samuel Price had tears streaming down his weathered face. Martha grabbed her husband's hand and held on like she'd never let go. But Wade wasn't finished. He banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. Additionally, I am recommending that the territorial governor launch a full investigation into corruption in the land office and other government positions. The evidence presented here suggests a pattern of abuse that extends far beyond this single case. And Mr. Boone, you will face criminal trial for kidnapping, arson, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You are remanded to territorial custody until that trial commences. Boone sat frozen, his face ashen. The empire he'd built through fear and manipulation had crumbled to dust in the space of a single morning. Ruby felt Colt's arm around her shoulders, felt Naya's hand squeeze hers, felt the weight of victory settle into her bones. They'd done it. Against all odds, against power and money and corruption, they'd won. As the crowd pressed around her offering congratulations, Ruby caught sight of her father standing in the back of the courtroom. Thomas Callahan looked old and broken, his hands shaking and his eyes hollow. For a moment, their gazes met, and Ruby saw something that might have been regret or shame or simply the recognition of how far he'd fallen. She felt pity for him, but not forgiveness. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. She turned away and let her real family, the one she'd chosen and who'd chosen her, sweep her out of the courthouse into the brilliant sunshine beyond. The celebrations lasted 3 days. Families brought food and music to Naya's trading post, transforming it into a festival ground. People who'd lived in fear for years finally dared to laugh and dance and plan for futures they'd stopped believing in. The river crossing was declared public land held in trust for the valley's residents, with Ruby as its steward. She immediately established the water-sharing agreement her mother had envisioned, fair access for all during drought seasons with no tolls or fees. The decision transformed her from landowner to community leader almost overnight. People came to her with disputes to mediate, with plans for cooperative irrigation systems, with proposals for protecting the valley from future exploitation. Ruby found herself building something her mother would have been proud of, not an empire, but a commonwealth. Margaret proved invaluable in this work, her skills with paperwork and legal documents helping establish formal agreements that protected everyone's interests. She'd found purpose and family in the valley, and watching her transform from frightened clerk to confident organizer filled Ruby with quiet pride. The criminal trials took months to work through the territorial courts, but the outcomes were decisive. Boone was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. Marsh was arrested in California and brought back to face corruption charges. A dozen other officials were removed from office or faced prosecution. The investigation expanded far beyond the river crossing case, eventually reshaping territorial governance in ways that would benefit honest settlers for generations. As autumn painted this valley in shades of gold and crimson, Ruby and Colt began building their future in earnest. They expanded the ranch, combining his isolated homestead with the resources from her property to create something larger and more sustainable. They hired hands from among the valley families, paying fair wages and treating workers with dignity that was still rare in frontier country. And when the first snow began to fall, dusting the mountains in white, Colt asked Ruby to marry him. They were standing at the river crossing when he proposed. The water running clear and cold over smooth stones, the valley spread out around them in all its harsh beauty. He didn't make a speech or offer elaborate promises. He simply took her hand and said, "Build this life with me. Not because you need rescuing or because I'm offering protection, but because we choose each other freely, partners, equals, family." Ruby's answer was yes before he'd even finished speaking. They married in the same courthouse where Ruby had won her freedom, with Judge Wade presiding and half the valley in attendance. Ruby wore a dress Naya had made for her, cream-colored linen embroidered with symbols of strength and renewal. Colt wore his best suit and looked so nervous Ruby had to hide her smile behind her bouquet. The ceremony was simple but profound. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises about standing together through hard seasons, about building something worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment, about choosing partnership over power and community over conquest. When Wade pronounced them married, the crowd erupted in cheers that probably echoed all the way to the mountains. The reception lasted until dawn, filled with music and dancing and stories shared around bonfires. Ruby danced with Colt, with Samuel Price, with Daniel Garrett's youngest daughter, who was just learning her steps. She embraced Naya and Margaret and Martha and dozens of others who'd become her people. As the celebration wound down and the sky began to lighten with approaching sunrise, Ruby and Colt slipped away from the crowd. They rowed back to the river crossing and sat on the bank watching the water flow past, their fingers intertwined. "Do you think she can see this?" Ruby asked softly, thinking of her mother. "Do you think she knows what we built?" "I think she knows," Colt replied. "I think she's been watching over you this whole time, proud of every choice you made." Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the quiet strength that had become her anchor. "I used to think being rescued meant someone swooping in to solve my problems, but you taught me something better. You taught me to rescue myself. And then you stood beside me while I did it." "We rescued each other," Colt said. "I was alive before I met you, but I wasn't living. You showed me what it means to fight for something bigger than survival, to build instead of just endure." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose over the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and chickens clucked, and the ordinary sounds of frontier life continued their eternal rhythm. But for Ruby, nothing about this moment felt ordinary. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the saloon porch to this riverbank, from powerless to powerful, from isolated to beloved. She thought about all the people who'd stood with her and all the battles they'd won together. She thought about the future stretching ahead, uncertain and difficult and absolutely worth fighting for. The girl who'd been sold like livestock was gone forever. In her place was Ruby Mercer, landowner and leader, wife and warrior, living proof that courage could change everything. Years later, when their children were old enough to understand, Ruby and Colt would tell them the story of how they met. They'd talk about the saloon porch and the river crossing, about Judge Wade and Jeremiah Boone, about Naya and Margaret, and all the people who'd chosen to stand together when standing alone would have been easier. They'd tell their children that the valley's prosperity wasn't built on cruelty or conquest, but on community and courage. That the strongest person wasn't the one who dominated others, but the one brave enough to lift others up. And they'd teach them the lesson Ruby had learned in blood and fire and hope. That true freedom isn't something someone gives you. It's something you claim for yourself and then fiercely protect so others can claim it too. The river would keep flowing through the crossing, cold and clear and accessible to all. The valley would keep growing, nourished by water and sustained by the agreements Ruby had established. And the story of the girl who refused to surrender would become legend, passed down through generations as proof that even in the harshest country, justice could survive if people were willing to fight for it. Ruby Callahan, now Ruby Mercer, had become more than a survivor. She'd become a symbol, a reminder that the arc of history bends toward justice, but only when brave people grab hold and pull. As the sun climbed higher and the day's work beckoned, Ruby and Colt rose from the riverbank and mounted their horses. They had a ranch to run, a community to serve, and a life to build together. But before they rode away, Ruby looked back one last time at the water flowing freely over the stones. She thought of her mother's words, "Stay strong, stay free," and felt them settle into her heart like a benediction. She had stayed strong, she had stayed free, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that others could do the same. The mountain river thundered through the valley she'd fought to protect, and in its endless song, Ruby heard the truth that had changed everything. The strongest person in harsh country wasn't the cruelest one. It was the person brave enough to stand up, choose freedom, and never kneel again. And Ruby Mercer would never kneel again.